They watched in disbelief, the men of the defeated world, their cities still burning, their dreams reduced to ash. From across the ocean came a sound unlike anything they had heard before, the low metallic groan of something vast being born. A ship, 441 feet long, sliding into the grey waters of San Francisco Bay. The SS Robert E. Peary, built not in months, not in weeks, but in just over 4 days. To the soldiers and engineers of the fallen empires, it was as if reality itself had cracked. What kind of civilization could build a vessel faster than they could bury their dead? They had once believed in mastery, in tradition, in the slow perfection of craft. A German shipwright could spend half a lifetime learning the secrets of steel. A Japanese builder would bow before the spirit of the material. But now they saw a different kind of creation, cold, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. In the hands of the Americans, industry had become something alive, something that devoured limitations and spat out miracles. These were not ships of wood and pride. They were ships of rhythm, repetition, and unshakable belief in progress. To those who had lost the war, they seemed almost supernatural. From their perspective, the war had not just been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories. While Europe still prayed for perfection, America had found power in imperfection. While their engineers argued over tradition, ordinary men and women across the ocean were learning to weld steel by the thousands. Farmers, secretaries, and housewives turned into shipbuilders overnight. It was not the triumph of skill, but the triumph of faith. Faith that speed and simplicity could outmatch precision and hierarchy. And as the Liberty ships multiplied like steel ghosts across the seas, those who watched from the ruins understood something devastating. They were witnessing not only their defeat, but the birth of a new order. A world where strength came not from heritage, but from adaptability, where the machine replaced the master, where the impossible had become procedure. It was the end of an age and the beginning of another. They had fought to defend their empires, their traditions, their gods of craftsmanship, but the gods had fallen silent. From the smoke and silence of defeat, a single haunting question rose. If this is what they can build in 4 days, what will they build next? It began with a sound that did not belong to this earth, a deep metallic roar that rolled across the bay and echoed against the fog. Those who heard it would later say, it was not the sound of a ship being born, but of an age dying. The SS Robert E. Peary slid into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay on November 12, 1942, and somewhere across the Atlantic, men who had believed in discipline, blood, and steel felt the foundations of their world crumble. They did not see the ship, but they heard the news. A cargo vessel, complete and ready for sea, built in just 4 days. Not even the most fanatical believer in German precision could understand how such a thing was possible. Inside bomb shelters in Hamburg, in the ruins of Bremen, in the offices of exhausted Japanese engineers, a terrible realization spread. The war they had prepared for was already lost, not because of courage or cowardice, but because of something invisible, a new way of thinking. The Americans had changed the rules of creation itself. To those on the losing side, it felt like watching a god emerge from smoke and industry. Their old equations no longer worked. Their pride in mastery, their worship of perfection, their faith in the individual craftsman, all meaningless in the face of this new monster of efficiency. One German engineer, writing in his private notes, called it der Albtraum der Geschwindigkeit, the nightmare of speed. He had spent 20 years building ships that took months to complete. He had believed that quality was a moral duty, that art and accuracy were forms of patriotism. But now, his enemy was building ships. Like bread loaves, each one stamped from fire and time. He asked in despair, if a people can build a ship in 4 days, can they also build a new world in 4 years? The question haunted more than just him. In Italy, Mussolini's factories had been paralyzed by bureaucracy and pride. In Japan, engineers still drew designs by hand with reverence for ancient craft. In Germany, where every bolt was measured and every tool forged to perfection, the idea of imperfection as progress was unthinkable. And yet, America had done it, not by perfecting, but by simplifying. not by reverence, but by audacity. They called them Liberty ships. To the Allies, they were symbols of hope. To the defeated, they were omens of extinction. Every new hull that touched the water was another reminder that the old gods of skill and tradition had been replaced by something colder, a system that believed in the power of ordinary people to do the impossible when organized with precision and faith. For the losing nations, it was more than defeat. It was humiliation. The enemy had not only destroyed their armies, he had proven that his chaos could outproduce their order. In Berlin, a captured American propaganda film showing the Richmond Shipyards played for a group of engineers in early 1943. The footage showed rows of women welding, their faces masked by sparks, and massive cranes lifting pre-assembled sections into place. The German officers watching did not applaud or speak. One of them, a naval architect from Kiel, whispered almost to himself, "They have removed the soul from the ship." Another replied, "No, they have given it a new one." It was a moment of quiet terror, the understanding that victory no longer belonged to nations that built the best machines, but to those who built the most. And yet, behind that realization was something more human, something that touched even the hearts of the defeated. They had believed the Americans to be undisciplined, distracted, a people of comfort and abundance. But what kind of comfort could build ships overnight? What kind of abundance could weld steel at midnight with hands trembling from exhaustion? They began to understand that what they were facing was not just an industrial system, but a psychological one, a nation that had turned belief into machinery. The Liberty ships were not only made of metal, they were made of conviction. There are reports from Allied prisoners of war who, upon hearing of the shipbuilding records, were filled with a strange mixture of pride and despair. Pride because they were human, part of a species capable of such speed and creation. Despair because they realized the war was now beyond human. It was mechanical, mathematical, inevitable. One German officer captured at Stalingrad later said, "When I saw our supply lines fail, I did not curse our soldiers. I cursed our shipyards." Even among Japan's most devoted engineers, the news struck like lightning. The Japanese shipyards still measured progress by harmony and patience. The Americans measured it by output. One Japanese naval constructor reportedly stood silent before his men and said, "They have mastered time itself." It was not admiration, it was fear. In his eyes, America had achieved what even the divine could not, to make creation faster than destruction. The irony was that the Americans themselves did not fully see what they had done. To them, it was necessity, not destiny. But from the outside, from the ashes of Berlin, from the ruins of Tokyo, it looked like the dawn of a new civilization. Not one of art or tradition, but of method. A world where ideas could be welded together as easily as steel plates. A world where the individual was no longer the craftsman, but the component. And still, for those who had lost, there was a terrible beauty in it. Watching their enemy build in days what had taken them months, they saw in those sparks not just defeat, but prophecy. The world had crossed a threshold. The future would no longer belong to those who built the perfect ship, but to those who could build thousands of imperfect ones that still sailed. The lesson was brutal and eternal. Precision loses to persistence. Yet even in this realization, hope flickered in the strangest places. Some German engineers began sketching new ways of building, secretly admiring the American efficiency. Some Japanese officers spoke of rebuilding after the war using these same principles. They had been conquered by force, but inspired by speed. What they feared, they began to study. What they hated, they began to understand. The Liberty ships became both curse and calling. To the victors, they were tools of salvation. To the defeated, they were mirrors showing what they could have been if they had learned to let go of pride. The world of craftsmanship had given birth to the world of construction, and no one could turn back the clock. And in that realization lay the deepest wound of all, the knowledge that the war had revealed not only who was stronger, but who could change. The Liberty ships were proof that flexibility had conquered mastery, that innovation had defeated devotion. The old world had died not in fire, but in assembly lines. As the SS Robert E. Peary cut through the fog that day, her engines humming like prophecy, the defeated of the world stared into the darkness and asked themselves the question that would echo long after the war. If this is what they can build in 4 days, what will they build next? He had never built a ship. He did not even like the sea. Henry Kaiser was a man of earth, not water, a builder of roads, dams, and dreams. And yet, in December 1940, this man, unknown to the shipwrights of the world, signed a contract that would make him one of the most powerful forces in the history of modern industry. To the defeated nations watching from the other side of the war, his rise was not only strange, it was terrifying. How could someone who knew nothing about ships become the architect of a revolution that would drown their empires? In the quiet halls of Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome, engineers and officers studied his name as if it were an enigma, Kaiser. The Americans called him a builder, but the losers of the war saw him differently, as a symbol of something they could not understand, a mind unchained by tradition. They had built their industries on hierarchy, pride, and rules carved into stone. Kaiser built his on movement. He cared nothing for what had been done before. His power came from asking questions that others were afraid to ask. Why should a ship take 6 months to build? Why should only craftsmen make them? Why should perfection matter more than time? The first time he proposed building ships like cars, on assembly lines in sections, welded instead of riveted, naval experts laughed. Welding was considered dangerous, unreliable, almost sinful in the world of maritime design. In Germany, naval architects had built their submarines with surgical precision. In Japan, builders worked in silence, guided by rituals older than their emperor. In America, Henry Kaiser simply said, "Try it." To those who had already lost everything, this attitude was more frightening than any weapon, because it revealed something deeper than innovation. It revealed freedom, the freedom to fail fast, to learn, to change, to move. For them, failure was death. For Kaiser, failure was data. A Japanese engineer later wrote in his diary after the war, "We lost not to American power, but to American permission." They were allowed to experiment, to make mistakes, to dream beyond the manual. He was right. Kaiser had built dams through deserts, carving rivers where none existed. He believed that effort, not experience, created possibility. So, when he turned to ships, he did not see steel and rivets, he saw opportunity. He did not see limits, he saw a puzzle that no one else dared to solve. Think about that. In your own life, how many times have you heard someone say, "That's impossible," or "That's not how it's done"? Maybe at work, in school, or even from your own inner voice. That is exactly what Kaiser faced, a wall of disbelief. But instead of turning back, he walked through it. His story is not only about ships, it's about what happens when belief is stronger than permission. His factories were not just made of metal and noise, they were built from faith, the kind of faith that changes history. When Kaiser began his shipyard in Richmond, California, he hired anyone willing to work. Secretaries, farmers, janitors, mothers, people who had never touched steel before. The old masters of shipbuilding were horrified, but Kaiser saw something they did not. He believed that human beings could learn anything when properly organized and given purpose. It was this belief that broke the psychological wall between the skilled and the unskilled. And to the Axis powers, this was terrifying because they had built their empires on hierarchy. They believed in bloodlines of talent, in noble trades passed from father to son. But Kaiser believed in training, not heritage. He turned chaos into unity, and unity into speed. There is a story. From the early months of the Richmond Yard, a former schoolteacher named Ruth took a job as a welder. Her husband had gone to war. She had never held a torch in her life. The men mocked her at first, but within 2 weeks she was welding hull sections that passed inspection faster than those of experienced workers. When journalists asked her how she learned so quickly, she smiled and said, "They didn't tell me it was hard." That was the essence of Kaiser's world, a world where belief was stronger than experience, and simplicity defeated fear. The defeated nations could not understand how ordinary people could suddenly become extraordinary. They had never believed in the ordinary. In their systems, value came from status, tradition, and obedience, but Kaiser built a system that valued adaptability, creativity, and courage. He turned workers into inventors. His shipyards did not just build ships, they built confidence. Every person holding a torch became part of something vast, a rhythm, a purpose, a pulse of progress that could not be stopped. And yet, there was another layer to this story, something deeper and more haunting. The defeated engineers who studied his methods after the war described their emotions not as hatred, but as awe. One Japanese naval officer, in an interview years later, said, "When we saw the speed of their construction, we felt that the Americans had unlocked something spiritual, a belief that the future could be built faster than the past could resist." That idea broke them, because in it lay the realization that they had been fighting the wrong war. They had tried to preserve tradition. America had tried to reinvent it. Now imagine yourself standing there, on the muddy edge of the Richmond yard, sparks flying into the night. Around you, the sound of thousands of hammers, the rhythm of progress. You look up, and in 4 days, a ship rises from the earth. Not a miracle, a process, not an accident, a system. And in that moment you would feel what those watching from afar felt: awe, disbelief, and fear. Kaiser's way of thinking was contagious. It spread faster than any army. His ideas infected every part of American industry, assembly lines, hospitals, even education. He believed that complexity was an illusion. Simplify the process, trust the people, and everything becomes possible. That philosophy didn't just build ships, it built a mindset that would define the rest of the century. The defeated world realized too late that they had not been beaten by superior weapons, but by superior imagination. And that imagination came from a truth that still applies to you today. The limits you believe in are only as strong as your willingness to question them. The shipyards of Richmond may be silent now, but their echo remains in every innovation that begins with the words, "What if?" Maybe that is the real legacy of Henry Kaiser, to remind us that no tradition, no rule, no fear can stop a human being who believes that progress is possible. That is why his story still matters. It is not just about war or industry. It is about us, about how belief can transform entire worlds. When you look at your own life, when you see the barriers others have built around you, remember what those men in Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome saw when they looked at Kaiser's ships. They saw a man who refused to ask permission from the past. If that thought moves you, if it makes you question the limits you've been told to accept, then pause for a moment and take action. Somewhere on your screen there's a small red button waiting. Click it. Join us, because this story is not over. What you've seen so far is only the beginning. The next part will take you deeper into the heart of how one man turned ordinary people into builders of miracles, and how that spirit can still change the world today. Don't just watch history. Become part of it. From the air, the Richmond Shipyard looked like a living machine. Thousands of workers moved in perfect rhythm. Cranes swung over rows of steel sections. Sparks fell like orange rain. To the defeated nations, it was more than a factory. It was a vision of the future. The speed, the sound, the precision, it all spoke of a new kind of power. A civilization that had learned to turn chaos into order. And for those watching from the ruins of their own industries, it was a revelation that burned as deeply as defeat itself. At the center of it all was something no one had ever seen before. A shipyard that did not build ships in sequence. Every part of the vessel was created separately, in parallel, then assembled like a puzzle of steel. The Americans called it prefabrication, but to the traditional builders of Europe and Asia, it felt like sorcery. Where their craftsmen worked from keel to deck in slow ceremony, the Americans built everything at once. A hull section in one corner, an engine room in another, a deck house elsewhere, each built by people who had never built anything before. The idea was unthinkable, and yet it worked. What did it feel like, standing there in 1942, surrounded by the roar of production? Imagine it, 1,000 torches flashing in the night, trains bringing new sections every hour, the sound of metal being born. You look at your hands blackened by dust and realize you are part of something unstoppable. For the workers, it was more than a job. It was purpose. For the defeated across the ocean, it was the sound of inevitability. How could such order come from so much chaos? The secret was not the machines, but the mindset. The traditional builders believed mastery came from control. Kaiser believed mastery came from momentum. The faster they moved, the less fear there was. Mistakes were fixed as they went. Perfection was no longer the goal, completion was. The ship did not need to be beautiful. It only needed to sail. Now stop for a moment. What if you applied that to your own life? What if, instead of waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, or the perfect skill, you started building now, piece by piece, learning as you went? Wouldn't you move faster? Wouldn't you discover more? Kaiser's workers did. And that mindset, born in the fire of war, became the blueprint for modern creation. There was a strange beauty in it. The Richmond Yard was a city that never slept. Men and women worked in shifts around the clock, each one a cog in a vast symphony. There were no masters, only participants. There was no silence, only the hum of progress. A journalist who visited the yard described it as the beating heart of democracy, a place where anyone, regardless of background, could build the backbone of victory. To the eyes of the defeated, it was democracy made visible, burning bright in the night. But what they did not understand then was how deeply psychological this transformation was. Kaiser's shipyards rewired how people thought about work itself. The hierarchy of skill collapsed. The pride of the craftsman was replaced by the pride of the collective. Everyone became part of something greater, and that sense of belonging was intoxicating. It turned fatigue into devotion, repetition into meaning. The shipyard was not just a place of labor, it was a place of faith. And yet there were whispers of doubt even among the victors. Could this new way of creation be too powerful? Was something being lost in the rush for efficiency? Some old engineers in Britain and Germany wrote later that what they saw frightened them, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. They understood that once humanity learned to build this way, there would be no going back. What do we lose when speed becomes our new perfection? That question still lingers today. Reports from that time tell of visitors standing on the catwalks, watching entire ships assembled before their eyes. One British naval officer, overwhelmed by the sight, said softly, "They are not building ships, they are building the future." And in a way he was right, because the techniques perfected at Richmond would spread across the world. Japan, once the enemy, would later rebuild its shipyards using the same methods. South Korea, too, would rise from poverty to become an industrial giant by following the blueprint Kaiser had drawn in steel. The defeated nations did not forget. They studied every detail, every photograph, every report. They turned their humiliation into knowledge. The same minds that once built battleships for war would soon build tankers for peace. They adopted what they once feared, and in doing so, they ensured their survival. That was the ultimate irony. The victors had won the war, but the losers would master the peace. Have you ever noticed how the greatest lessons often come from failure? The Axis powers learned more from their defeat than they ever did from their victories. They learned that strength without adaptability is weakness, that perfection without speed is death, and that progress belongs not to those who protect tradition, but to those who dare to reinvent it. Kaiser's shipyards became the foundation of a new philosophy, a belief that systems, not heroes, create miracles. The people who built the Liberty ships were not born for greatness. They were trained for it. They became extraordinary because someone believed they could. That belief spread faster than any weapon. It crossed oceans, entered boardrooms, factories, schools, and homes. It changed how humanity worked, dreamed, and built. Years after the war, when Japanese engineers rebuilt their devastated industries, they kept a photograph of the Richmond Shipyard on the wall. It was not a symbol of defeat, but of transformation. They knew that to rise again they had to think like the enemy who had defeated them, to learn from his courage, not his cruelty. That is the strange beauty of history. Even in loss, there is inheritance. But if you look closer beneath the sparks and steel, there is another story, a more human one. The shipyard was a mirror of the world to come, noisy, imperfect, alive, full of contradictions. People there laughed, argued, fell in love, broke bones, and kept building. The ships that left Richmond carried not only cargo, but the fingerprints of thousands of ordinary lives. They were proof that when people move together toward a purpose, even the impossible becomes routine. And yet the question remained, what happens to people once the war ends, once the purpose fades? Can the same energy that builds ships build peace, or do the machines keep turning, searching for a new war to feed them? The men and women of the defeated nations looked at those questions with haunted eyes. They saw in America's factories not just triumph, but warning, a reminder that power, once unleashed, does not return to silence. They wondered if the price of progress was the loss of patience, reflection, and soul. They wondered if speed itself would become the next empire. That question still hangs over us today. In every factory, every office, every moment we rush to create something faster, we are still living in the shadow of Richmond. The world has changed, but the rhythm remains, the heartbeat of steel, echoing from a war that never really ended, only transformed. And as the defeated of that age watched the Liberty ships disappear into the horizon, they asked themselves one final question, one that perhaps we too should ask. If we can build anything faster than ever before, will we also learn to build something better? The night of November 8, 1942, began like a secret challenge whispered to the gods of steel. The Richmond shipyard was silent for a moment before the first sparks lit the darkness. Over 1,000 men and women were about to attempt something so impossible that even their own engineers doubted it. The goal was to build an entire Liberty ship from keel to launch in less than 10 days. No one had ever tried it before. The fastest construction so far had taken 10 days in Oregon, but this time the challenge was madness, 4 days if everything went right. The ship would be called the SS Robert E. Peary, named after the Arctic explorer who reached the North Pole. And like Peary, this ship would cross into a place no one else had ever gone. By dawn, the shipyard looked like a battlefield of creation. Cranes moved in perfect arcs, lifting pre-built sections like enormous steel bones. Sparks poured down like orange snow as welders worked in shifts without rest. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and determination. The noise was constant, the sound of hammers, torches, engines, and voices blending into one heartbeat. Outside the gates, journalists, officers, and shipyard rivals gathered to witness what many believed would be a glorious failure. But inside, something extraordinary was happening. The workers were not just assembling metal, they were racing against the limits of human belief. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the impossible became real. The SS Robert E. Peary slid into San Francisco Bay, her hull gleaming with condensation, her structure complete. The crowd gasped. There was no trick, no illusion. The ship floated perfectly. Her propeller turned, her boilers roared. It was not just a ship, it was proof that the impossible had a schedule. Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, who had once doubted the entire project, stood in stunned silence before saying, "6 months ago, I would have called this impossible. Henry Kaiser has made traditional wisdom obsolete." Those words spread through the newspapers like a spark in dry grass. The world was watching. For the defeated powers, the news arrived like a blow to the heart. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry dismissed it as exaggeration. But in private, German engineers read the reports and understood what it meant. If America could build ships in days, not months, the war was already over. The mathematics of production were merciless. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 2,110 Liberty ships. At the height of production, one new ship entered the water every 8 hours. The Axis could sink them faster than any navy in history, but never fast enough. The Americans had made destruction unprofitable. By 1943, the United States was launching more merchant tonnage every month than the entire Axis fleet could destroy in a year. Germany built 1,162 U-boats during the war. The Allies built enough ships to replace their losses 3 times over. For every submarine that stalked the Atlantic, 5 new Liberty ships were already being assembled. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided not by admirals, but by welders. And yet, the miracle of the Liberty ships was not just in the numbers. It was in the people who built them. By mid-1944, Kaiser's 7 shipyards employed nearly 200,000 workers. More than 40,000 were women, many of them working mothers. Over 30,000 were African Americans, some of whom had never before been allowed into industrial jobs. There were immigrants from 50 nations, Native Americans, the elderly, and the disabled. The shipyards became one of the first large-scale examples of integration in American history. It was not perfect, but it was progress born from necessity. Equality had entered through the factory gate. It was in Richmond that America built its first childcare centers for working mothers. It was there that Kaiser founded the first prepaid health plan, a system that would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente. These ideas were revolutionary. For the first time, industry began to care for its workers not only as tools, but as people. What began as a wartime necessity became the foundation of a new social model. Even the defeated nations took notice. In post-war Japan and Germany, the reconstruction of industries would borrow this same principle, that a worker who feels valued builds faster, better, and longer. Still, the scale of production was staggering beyond imagination. At the height of 1943, American shipyards produced 3 ships every day. The average construction time had dropped from 230 days to just 42. Factories that once built cars, trains, or even refrigerators were converted to make components for Liberty ships. Entire cities were transformed into engines of output. Richmond's population exploded from 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 in just 3 years. The same story repeated in Portland, Vancouver, and Tacoma. They became cities of light and noise, where steel never slept. To those who had lost the war, this was incomprehensible. The German economy had been built on discipline, not improvisation. Japanese industry valued craft, not speed. Italian factories obeyed hierarchy, not flexibility. But the Americans had combined all 3 virtues into one new principle: adaptability. It was not genius that built the Liberty ships. It was system. The defeated realized too late that America had mastered something more powerful than technology. It had mastered coordination. There is a strange paradox in progress. The faster things move, the less control we feel. And yet the Liberty ships represented control of chaos itself. They were imperfect, but they worked. They were simple, but they survived. Out of 2,510 ships built, only about 200 were lost to enemy action, a rate of just over 7%. For vessels designed to last only 5 years, many remained in service for decades. Some still exist today, preserved as museums, floating monuments to a time when humanity learned that speed could be a kind of strength. But progress always leaves a shadow. Even as the ships poured out of the bays, some old voices whispered warnings. What happens to a society that measures success only in output? What happens when the worker becomes part of the machine? These questions would echo through the post-war decades as the world rebuilt using the very methods that had once terrified it. Japan's shipyards in Nagasaki and Korea's massive industrial zones in Ulsan were direct descendants of Kaiser's vision. The world of war had become the world of commerce. And then came the other transformation, the one no one had predicted. The people who built the Liberty ships carried their confidence into the future. Women who had welded hulls became engineers, teachers, and business owners. African Americans who had led production teams demanded civil rights with the same discipline they had learned in the yards. Veterans returned to find a nation that had tasted equality, however briefly, and refused to let it go. The war had not only changed geopolitics, it had changed identity. One German historian later wrote, "In defeat, we saw that their true weapon was not their army, but their capacity for reinvention." He was right. The real victory of the Liberty ship program was psychological. It proved that ordinary people, given purpose and organization, could outperform centuries of tradition. It destroyed the myth of the specialist. It replaced heritage with opportunity. It turned workers into builders of destiny. The statistics of that transformation are almost unbelievable. The first Liberty ships required 1.1 million worker hours to complete. 2 years later, that number fell to 486,000. The most efficient yards finished a ship in 350,000 hours, less than 1/3 of the original effort. Costs fell too, from $2 million per ship to under 1.8 million, even as wages rose. And each vessel could carry over 10,000 tons of cargo, enough to supply an entire division in combat. In raw numbers, the Liberty fleet carried more than 150 million tons of supplies across oceans. It was the largest logistical operation in history. From the defeated perspective, this was more than numbers. It was a revelation of human potential. The Germans, who had built their U-boats in secrecy and silence, now realized that secrecy was weakness. The Japanese, who had valued perfection, saw that imperfection could be multiplied into success. The Italians, who had dreamed of empire, learned that empires could be built in factories. The war had become a mirror showing each nation what it truly was, and what it could become. When the war finally ended, the Liberty ships began to fade from the headlines. Many were sold, converted, or scrapped, but their spirit never disappeared. The defeated nations rebuilt their futures using the same logic that had once destroyed them. Germany's economic miracle, Japan's industrial rise, and South Korea's shipbuilding dominance all traced their roots to Kaiser's experiment. The world that emerged after 1945 was one that had learned from its conqueror. Efficiency replaced ideology, adaptability replaced pride, and belief, the same belief that had driven the Liberty ships into existence, became the engine of modern civilization. Still, even in triumph, there was melancholy. The shipyards that had roared with life fell silent. By 1946, Richmond was almost empty. The workers who had built miracles returned to quieter lives. The key cranes rusted, the sparks died, the sea reclaimed its stillness. But the echoes remained, in the hum of every factory, in the pulse of every city that learned to build faster, think faster, move faster. And as the world rebuilt, both victors and losers were left with the same haunting question. Had humanity discovered its greatest power or its greatest danger? Because once you know that the impossible is possible, what limits remain? The Liberty ships had proven that miracles could be manufactured, but they also reminded the world that when progress has no boundaries, neither does ambition. That question lingered in the quiet after the war. It still lingers now. What are we building today, and for what purpose? The world may have changed, but the lesson of those ships endures, that greatness can rise from ordinary hands, and that sometimes the cost of creation is the soul of the Creator. The war ended not with a single sound, but with millions of quiet ones. The hum of machines stopping, the hiss of cooling metal, the sighs of people who had survived. Across the world, smoke cleared and silence returned, but it was not the same silence that had existed before. It was heavier, full of questions that no victory parade could answer. The defeated looked upon their broken cities, their empty factories and their lost sons, and understood that something greater than territory had been taken from them. Their world, the one built on tradition, mastery and discipline, had been replaced by something they could not yet name. They had watched the Americans build ships faster than anyone thought possible, and now, in defeat, they watched those same ships carry food, medicine and hope to their shattered ports. The same cranes that had forged war now lifted supplies for peace. The Liberty ships, once symbols of terror, became symbols of survival. And for those who had fought against them, it was an emotional contradiction that pierced deeply. To be saved by the very machine that had defeated you. In the months after surrender, German and Japanese engineers were invited to study what had made their enemies so powerful. They walked through American shipyards, still smelling of oil and salt, and took notes. Some wept in silence, Others marveled at the courage of a system that had trusted ordinary people with extraordinary responsibility. They realized that they had not been defeated by superior weapons, but by superior imagination. The Americans had believed in progress as faith, not theory, and that faith had proved stronger than any doctrine. What happens to a nation when it learns that its enemy's strength was not in cruelty, but in creativity? For many it brought shame, but also revelation. In Japan, young engineers began to ask new questions. What if we build with this same courage? What if we rebuild our country not with pride, but with purpose? And they did. By the 1950s, Japan had become a laboratory of reinvention. Its factories no longer built warships, but ships for trade, peace, and prosperity. Germany, too, found a new mission. Not domination, but precision. Not conquest, but excellence. Both nations, in losing the war, had learned the true meaning of rebuilding. Meanwhile, America faced its own transformation. The shipyards that had once thundered with life now stood silent. The workers returned home, uncertain of what would come next. But the lessons they carried could not be unlearned. They had seen what humans could do when united by necessity, when guided by belief rather than fear. Many took that energy into civilian life. They built cities, schools, and hospitals with the same determination that had once built Liberty ships. They proved that industry was not just a tool of war, but a force for renewal. To the defeated, that transformation was both painful and inspiring. They realized that their own failure had helped reveal humanity's greatest potential. If their loss had made such rebirth possible, then perhaps defeat itself was not the end, but a kind of awakening. For centuries, they had believed power came from obedience and perfection. The war showed them that true power came from adaptability, compassion, and belief in the collective strength of people. There are still survivors today who remember watching Liberty ships enter their ports after the war, carrying food to starving families, carrying coal to freezing cities, carrying medicine to the sick. Some of them had fought against those ships. Some had even tried to sink them. And yet, when the grey hulls appeared on the horizon, many cried, because they understood that the same ships that had brought destruction could now bring life. It was as if the world itself was asking for forgiveness through the work of human hands. Numbers tell only part of the story. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 2,700 Liberty ships were built. Over 27,000 aircraft were produced each year at the war's peak. The United States supplied nearly two-thirds of the total Allied war materials. But behind those statistics was something far more profound. The proof that collaboration could overcome chaos, that unity could outmatch fear. Even in defeat, the Axis nations learned that lesson and carried it forward. The global economy that emerged after 1945, an interconnected web of trade and cooperation, was born from the ashes of those shipyards. And yet, not everything about this transformation was light. Some feared that the very system that had saved humanity might also one day consume it. The assembly line that built ships would later build weapons that could destroy cities in seconds. The same faith in efficiency that ended the war would one day threaten the planet's balance. But perhaps that too was part of the lesson, that every creation carries a shadow, and every revolution demands reflection. So what does all of this mean for us today? It means that history is not just about nations or weapons, but about choices. The people who built those ships were not heroes carved from stone. They were ordinary workers who dared to believe that impossible things could be done. The defeated nations, through pain and humility, learned that belief is not owned by any side. It belongs to all of us, to every human being capable of creating, adapting, and rebuilding. The Second World War showed humanity at its worst, but also at its most inventive. It proved that destruction and creation are closer than we think. When we remember that time, we must do more than count the dead or honor the victories. We must ask what kind of world we are building now. Are we creating for the sake of peace, or are we once again building faster than we can think? The shipyards of Richmond, the ruins of Berlin, the silence of Hiroshima, they all whisper the same warning. Progress without wisdom is only another form of war. But there is hope in remembrance. Every time we study the past honestly, we rescue a part of the future. Every story of loss that becomes understanding is one step toward peace. The Liberty ships may have rusted away, but their spirit still floats within us. In every invention, every collaboration, every act of courage that builds rather than destroys. The true victory of the war was not on the battlefield. It was in the minds of those who learned that human potential, once awakened, can build not only ships but entire worlds. If you have watched this far, you already carry part of that understanding. Let it stay with you. Think of the world we live in now. The speed, the noise, the constant race to create more. Ask yourself, are we still building liberty, or have we forgotten what it means? The answer begins with awareness, with reflection, with remembering the lessons written in steel and sacrifice. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the past or about what humans can achieve, then take a moment to act. Subscribe to the channel so that more people can rediscover these forgotten truths. Like the video if it made you feel something real. And share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. You can even do it anonymously if you wish, because history is not only told by those who win, it is kept alive by those who care to understand. Together, we can keep that understanding alive.